welcome. Namaste. Our demand and need from the Gita have been established in the first chapter. We come to chapter 2. This saw publication first on the 15th of September in 1916. We have it here titled The Divine Teacher. Originally, it was the teacher, the disciple, and the doctrine, and appeared in 3 successive essays, the first in September, the second in October, and naturally the last in November. Parts 1, 2, and 3. We'll advert to that in a moment. Without interruption, I'm going to read the first paragraph in its entirety. The Divine Teacher. The peculiarity of the Gita among the great religious books of the world is that it does not stand apart as a work by itself, the fruit of the spiritual life of a creative personality like Christ, Muhammad, or Buddha, or of an epoch of pure spiritual searching like the Vedas and Upanishads, but is given as an episode in an epic history of nations and their wars, and men and their deeds, and arises out of a critical moment in the soul of one of its leading personages, face to face with the crowning action of his life, a work terrible, violent, and sanguinary, at the point when he must either recoil from it altogether or carry it through to its inexorable completion. It matters little whether or not, as modern criticism supposes, the Gita is a later composition inserted into the mass of the Mahabharata by its author in order to invest its teaching with the authority and popularity of the great national epic. There seem to me to be strong grounds against this supposition, for which, besides, the evidence, extrinsic or internal, is in the last degree scanty and insufficient. But even if it be sound, there remains the fact that the author has not only taken pains to interweave his work inextricably into the vast web of the larger poem, but is careful again and again to remind us of the situation from which the teaching has arisen. He returns to it prominently, not only at the end, but in the middle of his profoundest philosophical disquisitions. We must accept the insistence of the author and give its full importance to this recurrent preoccupation of the teacher and the disciple. The teaching of the Gita must therefore be regarded not merely in the light of a general spiritual philosophy or ethical doctrine, but as bearing upon a practical crisis in the application of ethics and spirituality to human life. For what that crisis stands, what is the significance of the Battle of Kurukshetra and its effect on Arjuna's inner being, we have first to determine if we would grasp the central drift of the ideas of the Gita. Well, over the weeks, months, and years in front of us, we will come and look at the historical and ethical context of this great teaching, insofar as we're capable to gather any clues from remaining evidence as to when it was composed, how it was constructed, how it grew, if it grew, all of that. But this is a signal truth, that the Gita lies embedded at the very core of the message, the entire message of the Mahabharata. Because how is it that we deal with division is the scope of its work. And if we have not inside found an essential answer, if we have not answered that question through spiritual realization, we have no answers for life. So, let's take this up with that in mind. What does this crisis represent? And Sri Aurobindo is never far from the true meaning of words when he selects them. Crisis in Greek is krises, which means turning point. And typically we know it in medical terms and sometimes in historical terms. In medical terms, a crisis is the point at which a patient turns and gets better or moves to perish. In political terms, it is a point at which we look, we act, and we perish, or we recover and go forward. We won't anticipate what we will learn as we look at the Mahabharata and the Gita's place in it. We'll save that for future moments. And we'll deal with Arjuna shortly. Tonight, though, we begin our work with Krishna, the divine teacher. He writes, very obviously, a great body of the profoundest teaching cannot be built round an ordinary occurrence which has no gulfs of deep suggestion and hazardous difficulty behind its superficial and outward aspects, and can be governed well enough by the ordinary everyday standards of thought and action. I love this, because we're reminded that this is in the middle of an epic, the greatest language, with the largest vision. And this is not for the mean-spirited or the cowardly. Stand aside if you must and witness, or engage in the battle of life. There are indeed 3 things in the Gita which are spiritually significant, almost symbolic, typical of the profoundest relations and problems of the spiritual life and of human existence at its roots. They are the divine personality of the teacher, his characteristic relations with his disciple, and the occasion of his teaching. Now let's look back. The original chapter title was The Teacher, the Disciple, and the Doctrine. When this was later renamed, the thrust of this sentence became a little obscured. The teacher is God himself, descended into humanity. The disciple is the first, as we might say in modern language, the representative man of his age, closest friend and chosen instrument of the avatar, his protagonist in an immense work and struggle, the secret purpose of which is unknown to the actors in it, known only to the incarnate Godhead who guides it all from behind the veil of his unfathomable mind of knowledge. The occasion is the violent crisis of that work and struggle at the moment when the anguish and moral difficulty and blind violence of its apparent movements forces itself with the shock of a visible revelation on the mind of its representative man and raises the whole question of the meaning of God in the world and the goal and drift and sense of human life and conduct. This is prose equal to the forceful prose that we see elsewhere in his writings, But this is also equal to the force of the language of Vyasa in the Mahabharata. Sri Aurobindo's prose is poetic and powerful. And it conjures, it brings to us the sense of what is present in front of us, as Krishna speaks to Arjuna on the field of Kurukshetra. India has from ancient times held strongly a belief in the reality of the avatara, the descent into form, the revelation of the Godhead in humanity. Avatara means one who has descended, literally one who has come down. In the West, this belief has never really stamped itself upon the mind because it has been presented through exoteric Christianity as a theological dogma without any roots in the reason and general consciousness and attitude towards life. But in India, it has grown up and persisted as a logical outcome of the Vedantic view of life and taken firm root in the consciousness of the race. All existence is a manifestation of God because he is the only existence, and nothing can be except as either a real figuring or else a figment of that one reality. We're back to the Isha Upanishad, which Sri Aurobindo wrote a lengthy commentary about. That monograph was titled The Life Divine, before the essays on the Life Divine began in Arya. All existence is a manifestation of God. That is the core of Vedantic teaching. Therefore, every conscious being is in part, or in some way, a descent of the infinite into the apparent finiteness of name and form. But it is a veiled manifestation, and there is a gradation between the supreme being of the divine and the consciousness shrouded partly or wholly by ignorance of self in the finite. A veiled manifestation. So if the divine is one, if there is only one entity, then the veiling cannot be accidental. And the enginery, the conscious enginery by which this is affected in the divine consciousness, in which self hides from self, is Maya. It is that force that permits the infinity of the divine to become finite, to take the fathomless reality that it is. In every direction, is there a direction? But in every direction, it fills and surpasses, but compresses itself into a form, a murti, with a name, nama, rupa, which has behind it the entirety of the divine. This is the beauty of its skill. How does the infinite measure out the world and all the souls that populate it? It is a wonder, and it is wonderful to consider. But it is most wonderful to realize and recapture. So, we have footnotes here. Supreme Being, Parabhava. Go to chapter 7, Shloka 24, verse 24. In English, petty minds think of me, the unmanifest, as being limited by manifestation, because they know not my supreme nature of being, Parabhava, imperishable, most perfect. The conscious embodied soul is the spark of the divine fire. And that soul in man opens out to self-knowledge as it develops out of ignorance of self into self-being. See this spark of the divine fire. This harkens all the way back to the Rig Veda, harkens back to Agni, the mystic fire, Lord of the sacrifice. It's not simply an image, but a felt experience, and one penetrates inside and finds the soul within, behind the personality, behind the mental ego and the vital being, and behind our emotions and our appetites and our very physical frame. There is this that persists. And when we come to know it, we feel that spark, and it wants to come out and grow and not be a spark, but advance, become a flame. And what it meets and touches, it sets alight, it purifies, it illuminates, and it offers. And all of its life is a continuing theme of sacrifice, of self-giving, of discovery. Back to Sri Aurobindo, of joy. So this conscious embodied soul, the soul has taken a form, condensed itself. So in this sense, the Dehi, you can find in chapter 14, shloka 20. A veiled manifestation, a gradation between the supreme being and the consciousness shrouded partly or wholly by ignorance of self and the finite. So you get the sense of that which descends, this great soul in us descends, conceals itself in ignorance, and then works to emerge from ignorance, develops out of ignorance into self-being. Swayambhu, that you recover yourself and you know what you are eternally. Self-supported, needing nothing, capable of freely relating with everything, because the universe is all about relationship. Working together. He continues, the divine also, pouring itself into the forms of the cosmic existence, is revealed ordinarily in an efflorescence of its powers and energies and magnitudes of its knowledge, love, joy, developed force of being, in degrees and faces of its divinity. Well, this is a description of the Vibhuti, and we go to chapter 10, many references, but chapter 10, shloka 40 and 41 for that. But when the divine consciousness and power, taking upon itself the human form and the human mode of action, possesses it not only by powers and magnitudes, by degrees and outward faces of itself, but out of its eternal self-knowledge. When the unborn knows itself and acts in the frame of the mental being and the appearance of birth, that is the height of the conditioned manifestation. It is the full and conscious descent of the Godhead. It is the Avatara. The Vaishnava form of Vedantism, that's theistic Vedanta, which sees the ultimate reality not merely as a blank, sheer existence, but as a conscious being. He has written just above, divine consciousness and power. And those of you who have been studying the Life Divine know how he wields that term frequently. Sat and Chit. Need not mention here the Ananda. Implied. The Vaishnava form of Vedantism, which has laid most stress upon this conception, expresses the relation of God in man to man in God by the double figure of Nara Narayana, associated historically with the origin of a religious school very similar in its doctrines to the teaching of the Gita, and we'll explore that more at the end of this chapter. But let's note that the idea of the avatara is not present much in the Veda and isn't spoken of directly in the earliest Upanishads. So it is core to the larger Vedanta, and it is the role of the Gita to advance this concept and make it meaningful to India for all time. Nara is the human soul, which, eternal companion of the divine, finds itself only when it awakens to that companionship and begins, as the Gita would say, to live in God. Narayana is the divine soul, always present in our humanity, the secret guide, friend and helper of the human being, the, quote, Lord who abides within the heart of creatures, end quote, of the Gita. When within us the veil of that secret sanctuary is withdrawn, and man speaks face to face with God, hears the divine voice, receives the divine light, acts in the divine power, then becomes possible the supreme uplifting of the embodied human conscious being into the unborn and eternal. This, of course, is chapter 18, shloka 61. And we refer here again to the veil which is withdrawn when we discover the divine. When we're no longer afraid. When the divine finds us and that veil is removed, then we come to know. That's the numinous experience. Seeing that great being apart from our normal self, greater than our own. But then we come into communion and interlinked, restored, feel the embedded oneness and the consanguinity of that divine bloodstream moving through ours. Narayana. Back to the disciple. He becomes capable of that dwelling in God and giving up of his whole consciousness into the divine, which the Gita upholds as the best or highest secret of things. Uttamam rahasyam. It means literally that, greatest secret. Connoting again communion and oneness. When this eternal divine consciousness, always present in every being, this God in man, takes possession partly or wholly of the human consciousness and becomes in visible human shape, the guide, teacher, leader of the world, not as those who, living in their humanity, yet feel something of the power or light or love of the divine gnosis informing and conducting them, but out of that divine gnosis itself, direct from its central force and plenitude, then we have the manifest avatar. The inner divinity is the eternal avatar in man. The human manifestation is its sign and development in the external world. So the footnote says, Chaitanya, the avatar of Nadia, is said to have been thus partly or occasionally occupied by the divine consciousness and power. he says somewhere in his correspondence as well that perhaps Christ was a partial avatar, not a full avatar. Partial ansha avatara. Because Chaitanya and Christ could feel their oneness and feel the divine moving through them at points, but perhaps not always. I think with reference to Yeshua, if that's how you say it, or Yeshua, I'm not sure myself, the sense that he felt abandoned, at the point of crucifixion, indicated that perhaps that partiality faded from him, and he forgot for a moment that he was one with that. The identity of Yeshua with the unnameable reality, which is symbolized by YH, etc., is not convincing. We don't have enough material to see that he declares himself to be the Son of the Divine. He refers to himself most often as the Son of Man. And all of this is in the Greek, not in the Aramaic, which he wrote in, well, he didn't write, but which he spoke. He probably knew a few Greek words, and I know I'm wandering, but if we're going to touch upon the idea of a partial avatar, we can linger for a second. I expect your full forgiveness. So again, the inner divinity is the eternal avatar in man. You have to find it inside. The human manifestation is its sign and development in the external world. He suggests here that there is a purpose for the avatar on this globe, that it signifies something. It is a sign. So what does it signify? We'll learn that. We'll enter into those streams in later chapters. But the avatar causes, stimulates, forces forward the world's development. Read the sentence. When we thus understand the conception of avatarhood, we see that whether for the fundamental teaching of the Gita, our present subject, or for spiritual life generally, the external aspect has only a secondary importance. Such controversies as the one that has raged in Europe over the historicity of Christ would seem to a spiritually minded Indian largely a waste of time. He would concede to it a considerable historical, but hardly any religious importance. For what does it matter in the end whether a Jesus, son of the carpenter Joseph, was actually born in Nazareth or Bethlehem, lived and taught and was done to death on a real or trumped-up charge of sedition, so long as we can know by spiritual experience the inner Christ, live uplifted in the light of his teaching, and escape from the yoke of the natural law by that atonement of man with God, of which the crucifixion is the symbol. The inner Christ. So again, referring to the inner divinity, as he did just a line or two above. But atonement, intransitive verb, it means originally to make at one, at one-ment, to reconcile, to unify. And what would the crucifixion symbolize? It's the point at which the vertical meets the horizontal, the transversal. And that point is the conscious, awakened soul within. So that what is transcendent meets what works in the cosmos, and the individual lights up the world with the consciousness of the divine. If the Christ, God made man, lives within our spiritual being, it would seem to matter little whether or not a son of Mary physically lived and suffered and died in Judea. So too, the Krishna who matters to us is the eternal incarnation of the divine, and not the historical teacher and leader of men. This takes us back to our demand and need from the Gita. It is our guru. It leads us through its substance to the light inside. And we have to work hard and persevere, but we shall in the end arrive at that recognition, that realization. It will change our life. And if enough of us did it, and we worked in solidarity with each other across cities and countries and around the globe, we can change the earth. Yes. We'll put a bookmark there. And I'm always looking for a relevant passage in Savitri to share at the end of our evening. So this is from Book 1, the Book of Beginnings, Canto 3, the Yoga of the Soul's Release. And this is on page 30. Towards the bottom of the page we'll start. In every hour loosed from the quiver of time, there rose a song of new discovery, a bow-twang's hum of young experiment. Each day was a spiritual romance, as if he was born into a bright new world. Adventure leaped an unexpected friend, and danger brought a keen, sweet tang of joy. Each happening was a deep experience. There were high encounters, epic colloquies, and counsels came couched in celestial speech, and honeyed pleadings breathed from occult lips to help the heart to yield to rapture's call. And sweet temptation stole from beauty's realms, and sudden ecstasies from a world of bliss. It was a region of wonder and delight. All now his bright clairaudience could receive. A contact thrilled of mighty unknown things. Awakened to new unearthly closenesses, the touch replied to subtle infinities. And with a silver cry of opening gates, sight's lightnings leaped into the invisible. Ever his consciousness and vision grew. They took an ampler sweep, a loftier flight. He passed the border marked for matter's rule, and passed the zone where thought replaces life. Out of this world of signs, suddenly he came into a silent self where world was not, and looked beyond into a nameless vast. These symbol figures lost their right to live. All tokens dropped our sense can recognize. There the heart beat no more at body's touch. There the eyes gaze no more on beauty's shape. In rare and lucent intervals of hush, into a signless region he could soar, packed with the deep contents of formlessness, where world was into a single being wrapped, and all was known by the light of identity, and spirit was its own self-evidence. The Supreme's gaze looked out through human eyes, and saw all things and creatures as itself, and knew all thought and word as its own voice. There, unity is too close for search and clasp, and love is a yearning of the one for the one, and beauty is a sweet difference of the same, and oneness is the soul of multitude. There, all the truths unite in a single truth, and all ideas rejoin reality. There, knowing herself by her own termless self, wisdom supernal, wordless, absolute, sat uncompanioned in the eternal calm, all-seeing, motionless, sovereign, and alone. There, knowledge needs not words to embody idea, seeking a house in boundlessness, weary of its homeless immortality, asks not in thought's carved brilliant cell to rest, whose single window's clipped outlook on things sees only a little arc of God's vast sky. The boundless with the boundless there consorts, while there one can be wider than the world, while there one is one's own infinity. His center was no more in earthly mind. A power of seeing silence filled his limbs. Caught by a voiceless white epiphany into a vision that surpasses forms, into a living that surpasses life, he neared the still consciousness, sustaining all. The voice that only by speech can move the mind became a silent knowledge in the soul. The strength that only in action feels its truth was lodged now in a mute, omnipotent peace. A leisure in the labor of the worlds, a pause in the joy and anguish of the search, restored the stress of nature to God's calm. A vast unanimity ended life's debate. The war of thoughts that fathers the universe, the clash of forces struggling to prevail, and the tremendous shock that lights a star, as in the building of a grain of dust, the grooves that turn their dumb ellipse in space, plowed by the seeking of the world's desire, the long regurgitations of time's flood, the torment edging the dire force of lust that wakes kinetic in earth's dullard slime and carves a personality out of mud, the sorrow by which nature's hunger is fed, the estrus which creates with fire of pain, the fate that punishes virtue with defeat, the tragedy that destroys long happiness, the weeping of love, the quarrel of the gods, seized in a truth which lives in its own light. His soul stood free, a witness and a king. Namaste, Jai Ma.